A 14th century Moroccan named Ibn Battuta once wrote that travelling leaves you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller. He was the greatest wayfarer and excursionist of his day. And it's the story of the Muslim world through which Ibn Battuta travelled from Tangier and beyond that we're going to look into today. Ibn Battuta was born on February the 25th, 1304, almost 50 years after the Muslim capital in Baghdad was destroyed by Mongol hordes. And why does the date matter? It matters because the sack of Baghdad in 1258 is regularly cited as the definitive end of the Islamic Golden Age in the Muslim Middle East, a 500-year period of cultural and scientific endeavour that was a source of inspiration for the European Renaissance. Once that Mongol army swept through the Middle East and sacked the seat of power of the once great Abbasid Caliphate, the Muslim Middle East would never again be the same. This was it, the end of civilization in the greater Middle East. Or was it? When Ibn Battuta came through some years later amid his peripatetic travels, he wrote, "The baths at Baghdad are numerous and excellently constructed. Each establishment has a large number of private bathrooms, every one of which has also a wash basin in the corner, with 2 taps supplying hot and cold water. Every bather is given 3 towels, one to wear round his waist when he goes in, another to wear round his waist when he comes out, and the third to dry himself with. In no town other than Baghdad have I seen all this elaborate arrangement, though some other towns approach it in this respect." Does this sound like a ruined civilization? The point of travelling with Ibn Battuta is that the journey helps us see the outlines, however hazily, of a bygone era. I might call him the Arab Marco Polo, after the famous Venetian merchant, whose account of his own travels electrified Europe when they were published. And yet, in his own lifetime, Ibn Battuta probably travelled 3 times as many miles as the Venetian. Indeed, by Marco Polo's own reckoning, his travels covered about 25,000 miles, or a third of Ibn Battuta's total. Now, while we move through the region, we need to keep 2 goals in mind. First, we are going to see what it looked like after the Islamic Golden Age is reputed to have ended, all the while noting the intellectual and cultural inheritance that it retained. And second, we're going to re-evaluate the somewhat conventional view that the Golden Age ended as abruptly as the 1258 sack of Baghdad suggests. And let me add my own thought, which is that the Middle East has never existed in isolation from the rest of the world. It has always been one with the world and world history. This was true before the dawn of Islam in the 7th century, as it has ever been since. Ignoring this fact can lead to misunderstanding and ignorance. Now, while our focus here is on the Islamic Golden Age and the Greater Middle East, which includes North Africa and the non-Arabic lands of Turkey and Persia, my natural inclination is always to look at the bigger picture. How did A affect B? Or what impact would X have on Y? And my sense is that Ibn Battuta's travels not only reveal the Middle East empire of his time, but, as I've indicated, also foreshadow another stunning era in human, cultural, and intellectual achievement in the European Renaissance. The start and end dates of the European Renaissance, like that of the Golden Age we will be examining in detail, are a movable feast. But many scholars are happy to locate the beginnings of the Renaissance in 14th century Florence, very shortly after the decline of the Islamic heyday between the 8th and mid-13th centuries. As luck would have it, the Italian scholar and poet Petrarch was born in the very same year as Ibn Battuta. And Petrarch coined the term the Dark Ages. He intended it to describe the almost 1,000 years of European history that preceded his birth in 1304. While the term Dark Ages remains in common currency, it's often avoided by historians of the Middle Ages or medieval period, who see it as inaccurate, negative, and misleading. Petrarch is also credited as one of the originators or founders of the Renaissance. I should say that Petrarch views himself in this light. He sees his career and poetry as ending an almost 1,000-year period of darkness that had descended on Europe, lifted by the shining torch of Petrarch himself, who led the people into a rebirth or renaissance between the cultural greatness of ancient Greece and Rome and the dawn of a new period of cultural greatness that would come to be known as the Renaissance. A modest man, I know. For 300 years before this self-anointed Renaissance man, European scholars focused their attention on the Greek and Arabic works of philosophy, natural science, and mathematics. In contrast, European scholars of the Renaissance, starting with Petrarch, were interested in Latin and Greek literary and historical works. This is important to remember, because even as Petrarch emphasized his debt to the cultural greatness of Imperial Rome and Greece, he loudly and utterly rejected any debt he may have owed to the work of Muslim and non-Muslim scholars from the Islamic Golden Age. When we reach the conclusion of this lecture, after our journey with Ibn Battuta, I'm going to come back to Petrarch and his claims to cultural superiority and uniqueness. In doing so, I hope to show how we're all inheritors and beneficiaries of the great advances in human learning that took place in the Middle East from roughly the middle of the 8th century to the middle of the 13th and afterward. So let's catch up with Ibn Battuta, whose birthplace on Morocco's north coast is just within sight of continental Europe. Anyone interested in the Arabic language should know that Ibn means son of, and it's a very common patronymic. His family was Berber, or native North African, known professionally as Islamic legal scholars, in which field Ibn Battuta also trained. Battuta, on the other hand, is not a common name at all, but rather the word for duckling. So our intrepid traveller is known to posterity as the son of a duckling. As hard as I've tried, I've never been able to find the source or reason for this rather peculiar nickname. Virtually everything we know about Ibn Battuta's background comes from his writings about his travels. These began as Ibn Battuta set off from his home in Tangier to make the Hajj, or pilgrimage, to Mecca in June 1325. He was 21 years old, and he wouldn't see Morocco again for another 24 years. So where did he go? And what did he hope to see? Well, his first pilgrimage was to Mecca in Western Arabia and other holy sites in the Islamic tradition. He wrote, "I set out alone, having neither fellow traveller in whose companionship I might find cheer, nor caravan whose part I might join, but swayed by an overmastering impulse within me and a desire long cherished in my bosom to visit these illustrious sanctuaries." Apart from the impulse to fulfill his religious duties and honour Mecca, Ibn Battuta was driven broadly by curiosity of the world around him. He had a thirst for knowledge, and he wanted to get it firsthand. The Muslim world was still expanding at this point, not least among the nimble Mongol armies that had destroyed Baghdad. To get to Mecca, Ibn Battuta journeyed across North Africa via Tunis, Alexandria, and Cairo, the latter of which he describes as a city boundless in multitude of buildings, peerless in beauty and splendor, the meeting place of comer and goer, the halting place of the feeble and mighty. From Cairo, he went north to Damascus, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem, before eventually turning back south to Medina and Mecca. Damascus had been the capital of the Umayyad Empire between 662 and 750, before the rise of the Abbasids, who made Baghdad their seat of power. When Ibn Battuta was in Damascus, it was still a bustling cultural and trade hub. With a population of around 100,000, Damascus sat at a crossroads that connected Rome's Eastern Byzantine Empire to the Middle East as far as Egypt, Persia, Asia Minor or modern Turkey, and the Black Sea. For the leg of his journey from Damascus to Mecca, Ibn Battuta travelled as part of a large caravan. The ruling Mamluks, a dynasty of former slave soldiers who ruled Egypt for more than 250 years, did their best to protect caravans on pilgrimages from Damascus to Mecca. While I'm sure they'd claim this was done for religious reasons, in truth, pilgrim caravans were the life's blood to the local economy, and it was in the authorities' best interests to keep these paths open and as safe as possible. Nevertheless, bandits were always a concern, and there was safety in numbers. After spending a month in Mecca, which entitled Ibn Battuta to the honorific of Haji, or one who has completed the Hajj, our young adventurer decided that instead of going straight home to Tangier, he wanted to continue his travels. And it's at this point that he really commenced the path to becoming a great traveller. Again in the company of a pilgrim caravan, Ibn Battuta set out across the Najd, the desert heart of the Arabian Peninsula in modern-day Saudi Arabia, before arriving in Najaf in modern Iraq. There he visited the shrine of Muhammad's slain cousin and brother-in-law Ali, who, according to the Sunni tradition, was the fourth caliph or successor to Muhammad. In the Shia tradition, by way of contrast, Ali was Muhammad's first legitimate successor. It is this definitional disagreement that divides the Sunni and Shia branches of the Muslim faith to this day, and which remains a source of contention and conflict in Iraq and throughout the region. Next, Ibn Battuta left the caravan he'd accompanied, which was bound for Baghdad, and instead headed for Persia, where he would spend the next 6 months visiting the Islamic medieval cities of Isfahan, Shiraz, and Tabriz in that order. Isfahan is one of modern Iran's most popular tourist destinations and was once known as half the world. In Ibn Battuta's day, Shiraz was the more prosperous city, partly because when the Mongol invaders arrived and demanded the city surrender and pay tribute, the rulers agreed and saved their city from the fate of Baghdad. Tabriz, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, actually prospered under the Mongols, when Hulagu Khan, the destroyer of Baghdad, made it the capital of his Ilkhanate, or empire. At the time of Ibn Battuta's stay, these 3 Persian cities were under the control of the Ilkhanate that formerly united Mongol Empire. The Ilkhanate itself consisted of 4 divisions or political entities, once ruled by a single Khan. Isfahan, Shiraz, and Tabriz were large, flourishing cities active in region-wide trade, and they offer a good example of the post-Golden Age cultural continuum. When Ibn Battuta visited Shiraz, for instance, he could have made the acquaintance of the Persian lyric poet Hafez. Hafez, born around 1325, worked through most of the 14th century, and his writing is considered a pinnacle of Persian literature. Hafez also impressed and influenced numerous Western writers, including Thoreau, Emerson, Germany's Goethe, and even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame. Holmes once said, "There is as much sense in Hafez as in Horace," meaning Horace the ancient Roman poet, "and as much knowledge of the world." To this day, some 600 years after his death, Hafez is considered one of modern Iran's national poets. And it's said that every Iranian household has at least 2 books in it, the Quran and the poems of Hafez. And while one of these books is not frequently read, the other one is. After visiting Persia, Ibn Battuta at last made his way to Baghdad, arriving 70 years after the destruction of the former Abbasid capital. He wrote, "The western part of Baghdad was the earliest to be built, but it is now for the most part in ruins. And the hospital is a vast ruined edifice, of which only vestiges remain." In spite of that, the rebuilding of Baghdad was begun even during the reign of Hulagu Khan, the Mongol leader who'd order it destroyed. From Baghdad, Ibn Battuta visited a few sites in today's northern Iraq, including Mosul and the Sinjar Mountains, which have been the homeland of the Yazidis since the 12th century. The Yazidis are Kurdish, not Arabic speakers, indigenous to modern Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Armenia. The Yazidis' religion is an ancient monotheistic faith which played a part in the development of ancient Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and Jewish civilizations of the Middle East, and was in turn influenced by the Zoroastrian religion of Persia and Islamic Sufism. Ibn Battuta next travelled back to Arabia, completing his second Hajj before moving on to Yemen. To do so, he sailed across the Gulf of Aden, a deep water basin between the Red Sea and the Arabian Seas, onto Somalia, and from there around the Horn of Africa and down the east coast of Africa via Mogadishu in Somalia, Mombasa in Kenya, Zanzibar, and as far south as Kilwa in modern Tanzania. It's exhausting just going through his itinerary. Battuta then sailed back up the coast to Oman and then to the Persian Gulf, on his way to his third Hajj in Mecca, and then on to various cities in Anatolia, including Constantinople, the capital of the declining Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire in about 1332. At this very moment in history, the Ottoman Empire was emerging in northern Anatolia. The Ottomans were, at least in terms of their cultural achievements, another worthy successor to the Abbasids, which should again make us consider any claims about the end of cultural progress in the greater Middle East, coinciding with the end of the Golden Age. From Anatolia, Ibn Battuta visited the Central Asian states of Afghanistan and India, and from there he made his way south to the Maldives, consisting of 26 coral atolls in the Indian Ocean, where he spent 9 months before moving on again to Sri Lanka and eastward to Burma, Malaysia, Sumatra in Indonesia, and possibly on to China. His homeward journey from China took about another 3 years. Arriving in Damascus in 1348, the itinerant traveller learnt that his father had died 14 years earlier, so he resolved to go straight home. He reached Tangier in 1349 and discovered that his mother also died a few months earlier, a victim of the Black Death. The Black Death, a pandemic outbreak of the bubonic plague, which had originated somewhere in Central Asia, then emerged in Anatolia, reaching Constantinople and the Mediterranean basin in 1346. The sea-borne nature of most Mediterranean trade at this time meant that by the following year, 1347, outbreaks of the plague were reported in Alexandria, Egypt, and as far west as Sicily. The disease's progress across Eurasia and North Africa was swift and remorseless. The outbreak burnt itself out by 1353, by which time it had killed anywhere between 75 and 200 million people. The total included at least 1/3 and possibly as much as half of the population of Europe at that time. Ibn Battuta said that he lost most of his family, friends, and teachers from his early life to the Black Death, and he was left totally bereft. Far from a glorious homecoming, he decided that there was nothing to keep him at home in Tangier in northern Morocco, so he resumed his travels once more. Arriving in Andalusia, he visited the city-state of Granada, one of a few remnants of the former Caliphate of Córdoba, which once covered most of southern Spain and Portugal. Perhaps the most important detail of Ibn Battuta's time in Granada is that while there he met and became friendly with a 28-year-old aspiring poet and historian. Fascinated by Ibn Battuta's stories, he began making notes of the places he'd been and the people he'd met. The young man's name was Ibn Juzay, and although their initial meeting was brief, less than 3 years later, Ibn Juzay would get the job of transcribing a full account of the great traveller's journeys. Crossing the Strait of Gibraltar again, Ibn Battuta next set his sights south and travelled to the Empire of Mali, arriving in 1352 in what would later become the legendary city of gold, Timbuktu, in the heart of the Sahara. For much of its history, the Empire of Mali was a remote but wealthy Saharan kingdom that attracted few visitors. But the rise of another Muslim empire and the 1324 pilgrimage of its emperor, Mansa Musa, the richest man who ever lived, brought it to the attention of the wider world, including Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta first visited Egypt in 1326, just 2 years after Mansa Musa, and it was there that he heard tales of the man whom, as he put it, flooded Cairo with his kindness. Ibn Battuta ventured 1,500 miles across the Sahara to reach Timbuktu, a hard journey but still possible thanks to the trade networks that connected the various Muslim Saharan kingdoms. Not always happy in his peregrinations, Ibn Battuta wrote disgustedly of the poverty and alien customs he encountered crossing the Sahara. He describes the oasis of Tagaza as a village with nothing good about it, and the most fly-ridden of places. He was, however, impressed with the large amount of gold being sold there. Elsewhere in the Empire of Mali, Ibn Battuta grumbled that female slaves and servants went stark naked into the court for all to see, and that the people grovelled before the Sultan. He even complained directly to the emperor, or Mansa, that the royal host wasn't generous enough to this famous travelling guest. "I have journeyed to the countries of the world and met their kings," Ibn Battuta told the emperor. "I have been 4 months in your country without your giving me a reception gift or anything else. What shall I say of you in the presence of other sultans?" This seems to have done the trick, as the emperor gave Ibn Battuta a house for the duration of his stay, as well as an allowance and a gift of gold when he set off home again. With all that Ibn Battuta saw and did, It's a pity we haven't more time to talk about his experiences across the very diverse lands that made up the Muslim world in the 14th century. But there's one thing I can't pass up, which is an opportunity to poke fun at this traveller for his regular comments on women. By his own admission, Ibn Battuta was religiously conservative, and he betrayed this by his regular comments on the modesty of other societies. In Timbuktu, he said that he was scandalized by the fact that women went about exposing their breasts, while in Turkey, he was upset that husbands and wives, while fully clothed, congregated together in public, in contrast to the societal norms of Morocco in his day, where couples didn't appear together in public. And yet, he celebrated the Maldives as an archipelago paradise, not least because it was so easy to get married and divorced, thus allowing him, under Muslim law of the day, to enjoy his maximum allotment of 4 wives at any one time. And so we return now to Petrarch, the Italian Renaissance scholar and poet, and to his negative view of the Muslim Middle East. Petrarch was right to acknowledge his intellectual debt to the cultural legacies of Rome and Greece. But so did the Jewish, Christian and Muslim scholars who had populated the Golden Age. In 1367, the year before Ibn Battuta died, Petrarch, the man often called the father of humanism, wrote a letter to the then Pope Urban V, in which he said, "I shall scarcely be persuaded that anything good can come from Arabia, but you learned men, through some strange mental illness, celebrate them with great and, unless I am mistaken, undeserved trumpeting. Well, as the saying goes, there are none so blind as those that will not see." Petrarch's undisguised fear and loathing of the Muslim world and his claims to cultural superiority and uniqueness wantonly ignored the fact that he, like all of us, was an inheritor and beneficiary of the intellectual advances that occurred across the greater Middle East, from roughly the middle of the 8th century to the middle of the 13th century and beyond. But I'm not willing to end this lecture on a sour note, or to leave you thinking that I'm anti-Petrarch. I'm not. While I'm a great admirer of his poetry, he's simply wrong in his dour assessment of the Golden Age. I think his conclusion was simply based on fear. The 19th and 20th century Italian philosopher and historian Benedetto Croce famously said, "All history is contemporary history," meaning that all historians operate against the backdrop of their own times, with all the concerns, prejudices, and wisdom that necessarily involves. For Petrarch, the rising power of the Ottoman Empire in the late 13th and early 14th centuries posed what he saw as an almost apocalyptic threat, that of a new, rising Muslim power threatening the West. The Ottomans had conquered beyond their heartland of northwestern Anatolia and established themselves in the Hellenic world of Byzantium, modern Greece, by the time that Petrarch was writing to the Pope. Thus, in a politically charged atmosphere, I'm certain he found it impossible to remain politically disinterested. This, I think, was the root of his distress and his inability to separate the intellectual achievements of diverse groups of people from the Muslim world in one era with the military conquests of another set of people from the same religious background in his own day. Aren't we lucky that we live in far more enlightened times?